60% of people in the UK have had mould in their home. For nearly a third, it's there right now, contributing to around 40,000 hospital admissions every year. This isn't a video about which spray to buy, because the reason British homes are covered in mould has almost nothing to do with how you clean them, and everything to do with how they were built. Across the United Kingdom, mould is not a rare inconvenience, but a common feature of everyday life. The English Housing Survey for 2021-22 found that 60% of households reported seeing mould or noticing a musty smell at some point. That's 12,500 out of just over 20,000 households surveyed, a figure that has been echoed in larger national polls. When asked if mould is a current problem, nearly a third of respondents, about 31%, said yes. This is not a quirk of one bad winter or a handful of neglected homes. The pattern repeats itself in every region, from the northeast and Wales, where rates climb to 35%, to the southeast and London, where 1 in 5 households is still affected. Government agencies estimate that around 2 million people in England are living with significant damp or mould right now. Broader surveys that include cold and damp conditions, often inseparable from mould, put the total at 15 million people across the United Kingdom, or nearly 28% of the population. The English Housing Survey for 2023-24 counted 1.3 million homes with visible damp in at least one room. In the private rented sector, the numbers are even starker. Social housing providers report that more than 1 in 4 properties has an ongoing damp or mould issue, and tenant groups describe the situation as routine rather than exceptional. The scale of the problem is not hidden in obscure reports or buried in technical jargon. It is visible in government statistics, housing surveys, and public health briefings. 1 in 3 households faces some form of moisture-related problem. For millions, mould is not a story about forgotten corners or careless cleaning. It is a reality that comes back year after year, no matter how many times it is scrubbed away. Doctors across the UK have grown increasingly concerned about what mould is doing to people's health. This is not just about a damp patch on the ceiling or a musty smell in the hallway. When mould spores become airborne, they are easily inhaled and can trigger a cascade of problems inside the body. The UK Health Security Agency has traced a clear link between mould exposure and respiratory illness, especially in children and older adults. According to their most recent analysis, living with visible mould raises the odds of an asthma attack by 70%. For children already diagnosed with asthma, the risk of a severe episode, one that leads to an emergency room visit, jumps even higher. The numbers behind these warnings are hard to ignore. Each year, around 230,000 years of healthy life are lost in England alone to illnesses caused by damp and mould. That figure, known as years lived with disability, is not just a statistic. It represents children missing school, adults off work, and families living with chronic breathlessness. The NHS estimates that about 40,000 hospital admissions every year are linked to conditions made worse by mould, from asthma to pneumonia. Professor Martin Woodward at the University of Manchester, who has reviewed dozens of studies on the subject, points out that children with asthma are up to 3 times more likely to have a severe attack if mould is present in the home. In his words, "We cannot afford to treat this as a minor inconvenience. The evidence is overwhelming." The risks are not limited to those with pre-existing health problems. Even healthy adults can develop allergic reactions, persistent coughs, or skin irritation after prolonged exposure. For the elderly, the danger is more acute. Pneumonia and other infections become more likely, and winter mortality rates rise sharply in homes with damp and mould. Underneath the surface, the science is clear. Mould is not just unsightly, it is a biological hazard, and it is costing the country both in health and in lives. Step inside almost any Victorian or Edwardian terrace in Britain and you'll find a quiet adversary built into the walls themselves. The problem begins with solid brickwork, walls that are often 3 bricks thick, laid without any cavity or insulation. These solid walls have a typical U value of about 2.0 watts per square metre per degree, which means they lose heat fast. Single glazed windows, still common in much of the older housing stock, are even less forgiving, with U values around 5.0. On a winter morning, it's not unusual to find interior wall surfaces at just 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, even when the room feels warm enough to sit in. Professor Andy Walker, a building physicist at Cambridge, has demonstrated what happens next. Warm air inside the house holds moisture from cooking, bathing, and even breathing. When that moist air meets a cold wall or window, the temperature drops below the dew point, and water condenses out, first as a mist, then as droplets, and finally as damp patches that never quite dry out. The colder the surface, the more relentless this process becomes. In modern homes, insulated cavity walls keep interior surfaces close to the room temperature, but in a pre-1970 terrace, the brickwork acts like a sponge for the cold, drawing heat away from the inside and keeping the surface chilly. Thermal bridges, places where heat escapes more easily, like window reveals, corners, and uninsulated lintels, become hotspots for condensation. The science is simple, but the consequences are stubborn. Every degree you lower the thermostat means a colder wall, and every colder wall means more moisture settling in. Even with the best intentions, there's a point where no amount of ventilation or cleaning can keep up. This isn't about how people live, but about how the house is built. The risk is baked into the brick and mortar, and it's the building itself that sets the stage for mould to return, year after year. Heating a British home has never been cheap, but the past few years have turned the thermostat into a luxury. In 2023, the average price of domestic gas rose by 68%, according to Ofgem. That kind of increase leaves many households with a stark choice: pay for heat or pay for something else. National surveys show that about a quarter of homes in the UK now spend significant time at or below 12 degrees Celsius during the winter months. For some, that means shutting off radiators in unused rooms or lowering the thermostat just to keep the bills from spiralling out of control. But every degree saved on heating has a hidden cost. In a typical pre-1970 solid wall terrace, dropping the thermostat by 1 degree means the wall surface cools by about half a degree. That doesn't sound like much, but it's enough to push the temperature of a cold wall below the dew point, especially when the outside air is damp and the walls are already uninsulated. Moisture from everyday life, cooking, bathing, even breathing, settles on these chilly surfaces, feeding the cycle of condensation that mould depends on. The link between energy prices and mould isn't abstract. When gas bills double, more people turn down the heat, and the walls get cold enough for water to condense. The result is a feedback loop that traps millions of households. You can't afford to keep the house warm enough to stay dry, but you can't escape the health risks of living with mould either. The problem isn't just about comfort, it's about being forced, by cost, into conditions that almost guarantee damp and mould will return, no matter how careful you are. A well-built house is supposed to breath, exchanging stale, humid air for fresh. In Britain, that natural exchange has been quietly throttled. The Health and Safety Executive sets a baseline: at least half an air change per hour, 0.5 ACH, is needed to keep humidity in check. Yet, in much of the older housing stock, actual air change rates fall well below this mark. The problem is not just blocked up chimneys or sealed windows. It's also the extractor fans, especially in kitchens and bathrooms, that often vent moisture back into the building instead of outside. A recent audit of rental properties found that around 70% of extractor fans discharged internally, pushing steam and water vapour into lofts, cupboards, or hallways. When fresh air can't move through, every shower, every pot of boiling water, Every breath adds to the moisture trapped inside. Humidity rises, condensation forms, and mould finds the perfect conditions to grow. The legal minimum exists for a reason. Without enough ventilation, the house stops breathing, and the consequences are written into the walls. Awaab's law sets a new pace for action. Social landlords must respond to emergency mould within 24 hours and tackle significant damp within 10 working days. These deadlines are not suggestions. They are now written into statute, with real consequences for missing them. In the first months of enforcement, regulator reports from early 2026 show 68% of emergency cases resolved within a day, and 67% of significant hazards addressed inside the 10-day limit. Yet, for more complex repairs, only 42% met the 90-day target, leaving many families still waiting. Sadia Ishak, Awaab's mother, spoke in a Panorama interview. "We kept asking for help. They kept saying it would be sorted, but nothing changed." Housing solicitors say the law has finally removed the old excuses. Now, when the clock starts, so does accountability. The regulator's next annual review is set for 2026, with compliance rates under close watch. Right now, millions in Britain live with mould because their homes are built to let it in, and rising bills keep the cure out. Until we treat housing as infrastructure, not just shelter, this problem persists. Mould is not a cleaning problem, it is a housing problem, and the house almost always wins.